Juliana Redding was found brutally murdered. I can tell you in 18 years of prosecuting cases, I've never had this much DNA.
How do you convict someone when their DNA is on the victim's throat, the door lock, the phone, and the stove, and a jury still returns not guilty? That is precisely what happened in the murder of Juliana Redding, a 21-year-old model whose case became one of the most confounding unsolved killings in Los Angeles history. This is a true crime documentary told in the order events actually unfolded, beginning years before anyone had reason to fear what was coming. Welcome to True Crime Case. If you're new here, we cover cases like this every week, real investigations told with the facts. Let's get into it. Juliana Maureen Redding was born in October 1986 and raised in Tucson, Arizona, in a devout Catholic household with her parents, Patricia and Greg, and her younger brother, Patrick. Those who knew her as a child describe a natural ease with people, a poise unusual for her age. She kept business cards in a leather briefcase that had belonged to her great-grandfather, and told people she intended to become a businesswoman. Her grandmother occasionally brought her to executive board meetings, where she sat quietly among adults who rarely paid attention to children. At Salpointe Catholic High School, she played golf for 4 years, her team ranked first in the state during her senior year, and was active in the school's drama program. A school advisor described her as someone whose enthusiasm for life extended naturally to those around her. In 2005, the year she graduated, she was selected as a Tucson Symphony debutante. That same year, she relocated to California to study communications at Santa Monica College. Her career accelerated quickly. She signed with a national modeling agency and began working part-time, first as a hostess and then as a waitress, while modeling jobs and music video shoots brought in roughly $3,000 per assignment, substantial income for someone her age. She rented an apartment near the beach on Centinela Avenue, a modest one-bedroom that she decorated herself, close enough to the water that she could walk to the beach after a shift. By 18, she had secured her first film credit, a supporting role in an independent 2005 film about college students and graffiti culture. It wasn't a major role, but for a young woman who had spent her childhood carrying a briefcase full of business cards, it was proof that the plans she'd talked about as a kid were starting to take a real shape. Acquaintances from that period recall her as someone who carried herself with quiet self-assurance rather than bravado. She was, by every account, constructing the future she had described as a child. In early 2007, while working as a waitress in Santa Monica, she met Dr. Munir Uwaydah, a Lebanese-American physician who operated a large medical business across Southern California. He was, by most accounts, an unusual figure to later become central to a murder case. A board-certified orthopedic surgeon and graduate of the American University of Beirut, holding medical licenses across 6 states, with a reputation among colleagues as both accomplished and, according to those who dealt with him professionally, difficult to pin down. He was already known to civil courts before Juliana's death, having faced a prior judgment for defrauding a medical supply company. He hired Juliana as a medical assistant, compensating her well enough that she purchased a Range Rover, and she eventually moved into his home in Beverly Hills. The relationship became romantic. Near her 21st birthday, her father, Greg, learned that Uwaydah was married with children and urged his daughter to leave, telling her he believed the man was dangerous. She ended the relationship before the close of 2007 and returned to her own apartment. That introduction outlived the relationship, though she had brought her father and Uwaydah together, and it was about to matter more than either of them expected. Not long after the breakup, Uwaydah approached Greg Redding, a pharmacist by profession, with a business proposal, an offer to run a company called Golden State Pharmaceuticals, developing a pain relief cream, with a reported base salary near $400,000. Negotiations proceeded for a period before Greg's attorneys raised concerns that the company was not properly licensed. On March 10, 2008, 5 days before his daughter's murder, Greg Redding formally withdrew from the deal in writing. This channel covers cases like this one regularly, researched and presented with the available facts. Subscribing ensures you see the next one. 5 days later, on the evening of March 15, 2008, someone entered Juliana's bungalow on Centinela Avenue before 10 o'clock at night. The bungalow sat on a quiet residential street, secured with barred windows and a front door that could only be opened with a key, the kind of home former prosecutor Alan Jackson later described as the last place a young woman would expect to be watched. Yet someone was inside before she returned that evening. The struggle that followed left furniture overturned and objects broken throughout the apartment. Juliana fought back hard. She sustained severe injuries in the struggle, including trauma to her head and throat consistent with a violent physical attack, and investigators later recovered her own DNA beneath her fingernails, evidence of just how hard she'd fought. At 9:53 p.m., a neighbor reported hearing screaming and the sound of furniture being dragged, followed by silence. Juliana attempted to call 911 from her phone. The call did not connect. Earlier that evening, her boyfriend at the time had called to check on her. She told him she was fine. It was the last conversation anyone would have with her. She was not discovered that night. Her mother, Patricia, placed repeated calls the following day without an answer and eventually contacted the Santa Monica Police Department. On March 16th, officers arrived at the bungalow expecting a routine welfare check. The front door was unlocked, and the smell of natural gas was immediate. A candle burned on the coffee table. The stove had been left on. The apartment had filled with enough natural gas that a single spark could have leveled the building, and only its aging ventilation kept that from happening. Investigators later noted that under slightly different conditions, the structure and the evidence inside it could have been destroyed entirely, along with any possibility of ever identifying who was responsible. Officers found Juliana's body in the back bedroom. 12 days later, on March 28, 2008, her family buried her in Tucson, in the church where she had grown up. At the time of her burial, no suspect had been identified. In the weeks that followed, investigators documented an extraordinary volume of biological evidence. DNA was recovered from the door lock, a plate in the sink, the stove knob, the front and back of Juliana's shirt, and her throat. A prosecutor who had handled murder cases for 18 years later stated he had never encountered a scene with this much DNA. None of it, however, matched anyone investigators could immediately identify. Whoever committed the murder had evidently expected the gas and the candle to eliminate that evidence by morning. The killer had left behind almost everything a lab could ask for, so why would it still take 2 more years, and an entirely separate investigation, to put a name to any of it? Investigators began, as most homicide investigations do, with those closest to the victim. Juliana's father directed detectives toward her on- and off-boyfriend, a surfer named John Gilmore, describing a prior violent incident involving Juliana's car and an argument the two had the day before her death. Gilmore acknowledged visiting the apartment the morning after the murder and stated he had seen a candle still burning through the security door. His DNA did not match the evidence, and he was cleared. Investigators also questioned a man named Ronnie Case, connected to Uwaydah's business circle, though he was never charged. Detectives then tested DNA from roughly 40 women in Juliana's life, women who had crossed paths with her socially or professionally, hoping one of them would explain the unidentified profile at the scene. None of it led anywhere. Somewhere in that pile of unmatched DNA was the answer. The question was who investigators would have to test before they found it, and whether that name would lead them toward a stranger, or toward someone already circling the edges of Juliana's life. The break came 2 years later, when investigators matched the unidentified DNA to a woman named Kelly Soo Park. Court filings described Park as Uwaydah's real estate broker, personal assistant, and financial manager, and, according to Uwaydah himself, his James Bond. Investigators reportedly obtained a sample by collecting a discarded cigarette but Park had left behind, avoiding tipping her off before a formal test could be arranged. When her DNA profile was tested, it matched evidence recovered from the door lock, the sink, the stove knob, Juliana's phone, and her neck. Prosecutors constructed their theory around timing. 3 weeks before the murder, Park had reportedly received a payment of $250,000, with substantially more transferred to her afterward, in addition to a standing monthly salary from Uwaydah reported to be around $10,000. Prosecutors argued this timing aligned directly with Greg Redding's withdrawal from the business deal 5 days before his daughter's death, and that Park had been sent to confront Juliana over the collapsed agreement, a confrontation that escalated into homicide. In 2010, Park was arrested, 2 years after the murder. Bail was set at $3.5 million, an amount prosecutors believed Uwaydah covered on her behalf. At her bail hearing, prosecutors described Uwaydah as a subject of interest in the murder itself. Uwaydah was never charged in connection with the case in any capacity. Shortly after Park's arrest, he left the United States and did not return. This production verifies every detail against public record before it becomes part of a script. If that standard matters to you, subscribing supports more of this work. Park's trial began in May 2013, 5 years after the murder. It drew national attention, combining a young victim, a Los Angeles setting, a female defendant, and a doctor who had already fled the country rather than answer questions himself. In her opening statement, the prosecutor described Juliana's final minutes as a struggle against a stranger who, after the attack, left a lit candle and a running gas stove in an attempt to erase the evidence. Expert witnesses spent days detailing how the DNA was collected and matched, alongside testimony describing how the attack had unfolded. Prosecutors also walked the jury through the financial records, the $250,000 payment, the monthly salary, the timeline that lined up with the collapsed business deal, trying to build a motive out of documents even though the judge had limited how far they could go in explaining Uwaydah's alleged involvement. The defense, led by attorney George Bueller, centered its argument on reasonable doubt, DNA and a fingerprint placed Park at the scene, but Bueller argued this did not prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. He also raised a physical argument, noting that Park, at 5'10" and roughly 150 pounds, would have faced significant difficulty overpowering Juliana alone. Before the trial, however, Park's defense pursued an alternate theory, that Gilmore, not Park, was responsible. The defense located a woman named Melissa Ayala, another former girlfriend of Gilmore's, who alleged he had turned violent with her on one occasion and referenced Juliana's death during the assault. Gilmore was later convicted of domestic violence against Ayala in a separate case, a conviction that on its own gave the defense's theory real weight. According to a lawsuit filed years afterward, Detective Karen Thompson, who had led the investigation from its earliest days, contacted Ayala before she could testify and told her Gilmore was upset by her statements. Ayala subsequently withdrew from testifying, and with her withdrawal, the alternate suspect theory the defense had built collapsed before the jury ever heard it. Because of that withdrawal, the trial judge ruled the defense could not present evidence implicating Gilmore, and separately ruled that prosecutors could not present their theory that Uwaydah had ordered the killing, nor the alleged pattern of intimidation attributed to Park in other disputes. What remained for the jury, then, was a forensic case stripped of context on both sides, overwhelming physical evidence, with neither side allowed to fully explain why it mattered. It left one question hanging over the entire courtroom: could DNA alone, without a clearly stated motive the jury was allowed to hear, be enough to convict? On June 4, 2013, a jury of 6 men and 6 women returned 2 verdicts: not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of second-degree murder. Park wept in the courtroom. Members of the gallery reacted audibly, some accusing her of guilt aloud. Even some legal analysts who had followed the case closely expressed surprise at the outcome, given the volume of forensic evidence presented. For Juliana's family, the verdict meant leaving the courtroom without a conviction, 5 years after burying their daughter. The case didn't end with the verdict. In 2013, California's medical board revoked Uwaydah's license after determining he had allowed a physician's assistant to perform surgery without proper supervision, the culmination of scrutiny that had been building against his practice for years. Not long after her acquittal, Park was arrested again, this time on fraud charges connected to an alleged insurance scheme valued at approximately $150 million, tied to Uwaydah's medical practice, with more than a dozen people indicted alongside her. None of these developments affected the murder case. Double jeopardy protections meant Park could not be retried for Juliana's death regardless of what surfaced afterward. Uwaydah himself remained out of the country for years. One report in 2015 placed him in Germany, though his exact circumstances were never confirmed, and to this day he has never answered for the events of March 15, 2008, in any courtroom. The DNA profile that took 2 years to identify still exists in a database, tied to a case the Santa Monica Police Department has never officially closed. The forensic science functioned as intended. It placed someone at the scene, on the murder weapon, on nearly every surface the killer touched in the moments before and after the crime. In forensic and legal circles, the case is still cited as proof that even overwhelming physical evidence does not guarantee a conviction. If a jury can see DNA on the murder weapon and on the victim's own neck, and still return no conviction, it raises a difficult question about what standard of proof could ever be enough. Tell us what you believe happened that night, and whether you think justice was ever truly served in this case.